Well, Peter, we've heard a lot about cloud computing, but how can a telco dealing in massive CDR use it? What, can you talk about that?
Sure. So big data is a big buzzword these days, for sure. But in the space of telco, we're addressing a couple problems, right? One is that the whole notion of the database kind of breaks down after about 90 days or so. And the reason we see is we tend to see that if you think of time equals now as a problem, it's very easy in the rear view mirror to go back only so far. And it gets harder and harder to have access to the data when the further back you go. And certainly to have it all available in a single database is very tough. So if we were to overlay on top of this sort of the difficulty of access to the data, we'd see that this goes up dramatically. And so we find that customers looking for data older than even a year or even more than a few months have a hard time sometimes restoring data off of tape. And that this is really a big sweet spot where big data can make a lot of sense. Now, in terms of what big data is doing, in the typical sense, it means throwing a lot of commodity cluster computing at a problem.
Yeah, what is the term cluster computing, in-house versus rented or public? How do you define that?
I'm glad you asked. So essentially what that means is that instead of getting larger and larger servers and swamping your IT budget, you can create a master server that can farm out work to many, many small servers. And that does two things. It means that you can store your massive amounts of data disparately across all the servers. And then that's one benefit. The second benefit is that you can have the server farm out work to the servers that already contain the data. So if you think about a hard disk having many, many blocks of data sequentially being read across the blocks, here you can have that all going on in parallel. And the issue, of course, is that you can try to build this in-house, but you're building a lot of CapEx money spent to keep these servers going all the time. In our case, we've looked at it, we've had to redo our air conditioning, we've had to redo our electricity, just to be able to store this. And we've found that it makes much more sense to use the public cloud for this sort of thing, where we can instantiate a ton of computing capacity for an hour or two or three or four for as little as we need it, and then have it all just drift away for another use.
What kinds of problems does this kind of an architecture solve in terms of storage, database, and economics?
Well, if you take a look at a telco that is really in the business, amongst other things, of creating a huge amounts of CDRs, right? You don't want to have to worry too much about where you're going to store it. So places like Amazon, which is really a leader in this, Google is another one. They've created, I'll talk about Amazon terminology, they've created something called S3, which is really a wonder of the world when it comes to storage. You can store and store and store and store CDRs on there and have them be there till kingdom come, really, because you never have to worry about provisioning more disk space. And they charge you per amount stored per month, and they have a model that's well thought through for that. But then that's the proverbial haystack that keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. As I've mentioned before, if you do it in-house, to solve the problem, you're going to have a certain amount of servers that by Moore's law are getting depreciated very quickly, and next year they're not worth as much as they were this year, and you're constantly adding more. Or you can go to Amazon and say, I would like 1 to 400 servers to go to town on this S3, because I need to find the needle in the haystack much, much quicker. And there's a terminology called MapReduce that's been very, very helpful to us and our customers in this regard. And it's similar in a way to taking 10 decks of cards and saying, the analogy that's always used is take 10 decks of cards, find all the aces. Well, you know that there's 40 in there, but finding them would take you a little while. If you could have 10 people invited to a party and hand out a deck to each person, say find the aces, and have them all stand up when they found the 4, you could just go through it much more quickly and then count the 4 and say there are 40. So the counting would be the mapping, the reducing would be adding up all the 4s and getting to your number 40. And of course, in the CDR world, that's just exponentially bigger. So it makes sense to store permanently in something that is stored and very well thought through. There's data that actually gets replicated across fault lines even, so if there's an earthquake in one zone, your data is safe. just an immensely complicated, but yet made simple for the customer way of storing a huge amount of data. And then lighting up the computing power when you need it to go after that data.
Interesting. What kind of deeper insights does this kind of access lead to? What can companies gain as a result of having gone through this approach?
Right, so we find that when customers have the ability to do lots and lots of data, they are inevitably interested in that long tail stuff, right? Where they have to go back and say, hey, at T minus 4 years, I'm looking for this particular needle in the haystack. And certainly regulatory reasons, it's been in the news lately a lot, that law enforcement expects customers to be able to do this and turn it around quickly. That it's a tremendous value to them for that. But we've also found that in the more recent rearview mirror, and this will be the subject of our other videos, there's an interest in being able to parse through this data, looking for fraud patterns, looking for marketing patterns, being able to predict churn. And we've done a lot of work in that in creating algorithms on this side too. So between the distant past, which is, let's say, anything more than 60 days old, to the recent past and beyond, looking at trends, we're finding a whole host of reasons why customers want to retain this data and help them with their regulatory, marketing, billing, all kinds of other purposes.
Now, these CDR sources that are being stored are very rich and very, very wide in terms of content. And it seems like there would be operations issues that could be addressed in terms of busy hours or network faults or any number of things that go beyond like demand quantification in a regulatory environment or what have you.
Right.
That data, once it's there, can be used a variety of ways.
That's right, and that's a very good point. And historically, where we've been constrained by hard disks and Oracle databases, customers have had to make the trade-off and say, well, we're only going to store these 10 fields for
Right.
posterity. And they have to manage the conversion. And we find that in the big data world, all of that's changing. We're finding that it's easier to store up on the public cloud just all of the data and make those definitions available to map-reduce programs that can then go in and parse through it, even at a much later date. So you're not, the end user is not left with having to decide a priori, what am I going to want to search for in the future? It's easier just to store it all and to go back at it and let them light up a ton of computing capacity for relatively short periods of time and not be beholden to that capacity on a continuing CapEx basis.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.